As we talked about in the last slide, the parliamentary inquiry in 2000, the Burning the Midnight Oil report, resulted in a number of significant changes in occupational health and safety law around Australia. These weren't mandated by the committee, but they were suggested by the committee in early 2001, and over the next 5 to 6 years, those recommendations have gradually translated into changed custom and practice within the occupational health and safety regulatory agencies around Australia. The first recommendation that came from the parliamentary inquiry was to shift the locus of control around the regulation and management of fatigue. They argued that the most important development that we needed to occur in Australia was the fact that organisations be required to implement a system for managing the hazard. Along with other changes that we've seen, moving away from compliance towards performance-based occupational health and safety, they acknowledged that it was extremely difficult to come up with a single set of rules that applied to all organisations under all circumstances. In fact, I think they were very, very profoundly influenced by the evidence that went to the parliamentary inquiry and were very persuasively convinced that it was a fruitless challenge. That is, we have been working for 70 to 80 years to try and imagine a perfect set of rules, and if it hadn't happened by now, it was probably unlikely to happen. So they made that fundamental shift and argued that the organisational responsibility is to have a plan to manage the hazard, and that we should allow organisations the flexibility and the responsibility to develop their own plan for managing fatigue. The second thing that came out of the parliamentary inquiry was the requirement that the details of what the fatigue management plan would be at the firm level did not need to be mandated or specified at the regulatory level. And they made 3 very important recommendations. The first is what we referred to earlier as the shared responsibility framework. Under occupational health and safety law, there are dual responsibilities of care. There is an employee as well as an employer duty of care obligation. And they said fatigue is one of the issues for which there is a profound argument in support of reinforcing the employee duty of care obligations. The second thing that they argued for was that we didn't need a whole new bureaucracy for managing fatigue. It's just another hazard. And as part of that, they suggested that fatigue management needed to be tightly integrated with pre-existing approaches and frameworks. The first of these that they supported was a risk-based approach, and they suggested that the standards for risk management under ISO 31000 now, but previously under AS 4360, were perfectly reasonable and appropriate and could be applied to fatigue as they could be to any other hazard. And they recommended that fatigue be incorporated within the normal risk management system within organisations. The second issue that they raised was that because fatigue is just another hazard, there were pre-existing structures, for example, under the safety management systems requirement under AS 4801, that would enable organisations to use the pre-existing policy frameworks and architecture for this. This was very important because a number of people had argued that the costs associated with managing fatigue may outweigh the benefits associated with better regulation. By requiring organisations to manage fatigue within the existing occupational health and safety risk and safety management systems architecture, it meant that the costs associated with managing it could be kept to a minimum, and therefore the benefits associated with a better management of fatigue could be realised more quickly. The other thing that was very important to understand here is the emphasis on flexibility. Yes, as an organisation, you will be accountable for how well you've managed fatigue, but we're going to allow you to work out what is the best way to manage the risk at the local level. And this represented a fundamental shift in the way that fatigue had been managed, both in Australia, but more broadly overseas. It's only in the last couple of years that we have seen the US, the UK, and to a certain extent Canada moving along this same path. Australia certainly led the world in this shift away from compliance-based regulation to performance-based approaches to fatigue. And for that, we should be very proud.